as long as I am in the world.
I am the light of the world.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Jesus Talks live stream. I am your host, Ari. Very glad to see you guys today. Today is going to be an early one, but it's going to be a very good one. I hope everybody has had a blessed week so far. We're finally on Saturday, so thank the Lord for that. But as you guys can see, today we have a very special guest and a very special topic that we'll be touching on today. Today we're going to be talking about the apparition that happened in Cairo, Egypt, Our Lady of Zeitoun. Now, there's a lot of people that are very skeptical about this certain apparition. So today I decided to bring in Dr. Travis Dumsday, who actually wrote a book on the apparition of Our Lady of Zeitoun, and who is going to be able to walk us through all the skepticism as well. Because a lot of people wonder, was this just mass hysteria? Was this actually even an apparition? Was it actually even Our Lady? You know, why didn't she speak? You know, is it true that a lot of people converted through this apparition? We're about to find all of that out today. So, as usual, I would like to thank Dr. Travis. Thank you so much for coming on here today and wanting to speak to us about this apparition.
Sure, yeah. Well, thank you again for the invitation.
Yeah, so very excited. So for those who aren't too familiar with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do currently? And what led you to want to write about Our Lady of Zeitoun?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy at Concordia University of Edmonton, which is a small liberal arts college up in northwestern Canada. So I teach mostly philosophy courses, a little bit of religion as well. In terms of my work in philosophy, I kind of do a mix of stuff in philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, some stuff in theology. And I got interested in Marian apparitions probably about 15 years ago when I was doing some work on the epistemology of religious experiences. So one of the big topics in philosophy of religion that gets a lot of discussion is, of course, arguments surrounding the existence of God and naturalism. Is there anything more to reality than just the physical realm? And so one kind of evidence philosophers debate when debating those issues is experiential evidence, right? Do religious or spiritual encounters provide any kind of valid or convincing evidence for the reality of God, or at least the falsity of something like a purely materialist or naturalist worldview? And so writing about that topic, sort of the epistemology of religious experiences, I came across not just sort of accounts of Marian apparitions generally, but happened across some information about these Marian apparitions in Egypt. And so I wrote a little bit about them in a paper I did back in 2011. And I've subsequently done some research on them. And then finally, during the pandemic, I was able to sort of sit down and do really thorough research into these events, and wrote a book about them. The book got published in 2024 with St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, which is sort of one of the major English language presses for Orthodox theology. But as far as I can tell, the books do getting some interest as well amongst Catholic audiences. The Zeitoun apparitions are, their status within Catholicism is a little bit complicated. So if you look at lists of approved Marian apparitions, like approved formally by the Catholic Church, Marian apparitions, sometimes Zeitoun will show up and sometimes it won't. And the reason for that is that the Vatican, so the Roman Catholic Church, never officially investigated the Zeitoun apparitions. They never officially pronounced on them. However, the Coptic Catholic Church, so in other words, the Uniate Church of Egypt, so these are Catholics in union with Rome, who sort of broke away from the majority Coptic Church in the 1700s. They're a pretty small movement within Egypt, but anyway, they are still an official branch of the sort of Eastern Catholic churches. And their Cardinal Stephanos, did officially approve the Zeitoun apparitions as they were ongoing in Egypt. And so again, sometimes you'll see Zeitoun included on lists of Catholic Marian apparitions, sometimes you won't. It's because of this weird, this complicated status that Eastern Catholic churches have within the larger Catholic Church.
Yeah, so I guess for those who are curious, so why don't you kind of walk us through this apparition? What exactly happened? How did this happen? What was the reaction back then? Kind of just lay out the background for us. So for those who are, maybe this is the first time that they're going to hear about it, so maybe they can kind of get the idea of what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah, so the apparition began on April 2nd, 1968 in Zeitoun, Egypt. Zeitoun is a suburb of Cairo. Egypt in the 1960s was a 90% Muslim majority country. It still is. The other 10% are mostly Coptic Orthodox. So the Copts, COPTS, the Copts, are the indigenous people of pre-Islamic Egypt. So before Egypt was colonized by the Arab Islamic invasions in the 7th century AD, Egypt was ethnically Coptic and religiously part of the Coptic Orthodox Church, and only very, very gradually became a Muslim majority nation after that initial period of colonization. So 1960s Egypt, we've got a 90% Muslim majority country, but a strong and faithful 10% minority Coptic Orthodox population as well. And so Egypt had limited freedom of religion. So there were churches which people were allowed to attend, but there were definitely pretty strict social and even legal restrictions on things like conversion. So if you were born a Muslim, the social and legal expectation was you would die a Muslim, right? You would not change your religion. Anyway, I give that just sort of as part of some general background that'll become relevant shortly. Anyway, so April 2nd, 1968, in the early evening, at St. Mary's Coptic Orthodox Church in Zeitoun, some workers at one of the local public transit stations that was across the street from the church are sort of taking an evening coffee break. And so they're outside, and they notice this woman on the roof of the church. And initially they get concerned. Right? This is a very unusual occurrence. They actually at first are concerned this might be like a nun who's gone up to the roof of the church to kill herself, right, to throw herself off the roof. And so they call the authorities, or they call the police to come out, and they sort of run over across the street to the church to start shouting at this woman. And they realize, when they get a bit closer, they realize this figure is actually glowing. This figure is a female figure, but it's glowing. It's floating atop the roof of the church. Pretty soon, a crowd starts to develop, and because this glowing, floating female figure is floating above the roof of St. Mary's Church, of course, the crowd draws the connection and starts thinking, well, maybe this is the Virgin Mary, and so they start calling out to her for a blessing. The crowd starts getting bigger and bigger. The chief priest of this church is summoned, and so law enforcement does eventually arrive, and so everyone is seeing this glowing, floating female figure, stays for a period of time, and then disappears. And so that's the first night of the apparition. This figure doesn't say anything, doesn't communicate with anyone. It's just a visual appearance of this apparition. So the news of this spreads quickly throughout the neighborhood. Then nothing happens for a couple of days. Then a couple of days later, the figure appears again, glowing, floating above the roof of this church. Again, large crowds assemble, and then she keeps appearing at irregular, unpredictable intervals. in the succeeding weeks. And as news spreads and as the media within Egypt start covering these events, you start to get tens of thousands of people camping outside this church every night. So the Egyptian government quickly has to be concerned with practical matters of crowd control. Eventually, as the crowds grow further and further, they actually have to tear down the public transit station across the street just to make more room for people. They have to cut down a lot of the trees surrounding the church, again, to make more room for people and to give them a clearer vantage point. So you've got, again, huge numbers of people, both Muslims and Christians, camping out in front of this church every night. And again, some nights, nothing happens. Other nights, the figure appears for a brief period, maybe 15, 20 minutes at a time. Other nights, she appears for hours at a time. And it's during those really extended apparitions. Some of those nights are the nights where you got really, really massive crowds assembling around the church. And what we can tell from contemporaneous eyewitness accounts that were published in Egyptian newspapers at the time, that were recorded by scholars in Egypt at the time who were studying these events. People there were seeing the same thing at the same time. This is a genuinely intersubjective apparition. In other words, it was publicly observable. Various people were seeing the same thing at the same time. This was not a private apparition. This was not, as you put it, this was not mass hysteria or something like a mass hallucination. It seems to have been a genuine, observable entity that people were seeing. And we know from analyzing that eyewitness data that people were seeing, the reports of what they were seeing are very consistent, right? They broadly converge, even in some cases, on matters of small detail. So what gets the most amount of attention in terms of the phenomena that was being witnessed was, again, this glowing, floating female figure who was almost universally identified as the Virgin Mary. But there were other things seen as well. So people recorded glowing birds that would fly around the church sometimes during these events. Clouds of smoke that would appear spontaneously and sometimes take on shapes. Other anomalous lights. So there's a variety of sort of seemingly supernatural or paranormal phenomena occurring during these events. But what gets the most amount of attention, the most amount of discussion, was this apparent image of the Virgin Mary, which people described as being very solid looking, three-dimensional. Right? This was not just, this was not some kind of projection. It was clearly a three-dimensional image that people were seeing. So this went on for months and months. Again, sometimes the crowds grew to, one Egyptian newspaper report had a crowd estimate of 250,000 people at one point crowded around this church. And so the crowds were massive. Lots of people were there and seeing this. It got lots of media coverage within Egypt at the time. It got some media coverage in the international media. So the New York Times did a story on this in August 1968. They sent out a reporter who talked about this. So they get some attention in the Western media, but mostly knowledge of this was restricted to sort of Egypt and the global Coptic diaspora. So these events continued. They were subject to an official investigation by the Coptic Orthodox Church, which declared them to be authentic while they were still ongoing. The Egyptian government did its own official investigation. They declared that these were supernatural events, which is sort of historically unique. It's not common for governments to issue official reports on the supernatural or the paranormal, but the Egyptian government did that. And so these events continued. They gradually tapered off through 1969. And then, so the figure was still appearing through 1969, 1970, but with gradually diminishing frequency. And then the final apparition occurred in 1971, after which these events halted completely. So that's roughly the sequence of events from beginning in April 1968 up through sort of spring 1971.
Okay. And so I know one of the most important things that happened from this apparition is that a lot of people converted to Christianity, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, that's a tricky question, right? So this is one of the reasons why I mentioned before that Egypt in the 1960s and to some extent still today has limited freedom of religion, right? And so it is dangerous socially and legally to convert from Islam to Christianity. So we know that there were some conversions taking place during these events, that there were some Muslims being baptized in the Coptic Orthodox Church. We know that from interviews done with sort of semi-secretly with anonymous Coptic clergy at the time. But those baptisms were kept really secret. And generally speaking, the people converting didn't publicly talk about it. So we have no reliable numbers, no reliable estimates on like the number of conversions taking place. But what we do know, and what historians of modern Egypt have written about pretty openly, is that these events led to a general religious revival in Egypt. So the monasteries, the Coptic Christian monasteries in Egypt underwent a huge revival. From the 1960s onwards, they had huge numbers of vocations coming in after this, whereas previously they had very few, right? The monasteries were kind of dying out prior to these events. It also affected a religious revival, you might think somewhat oddly, but even in Islam. So the practice of Islam after these events also increased. Quranic study circles and things like this definitely had a major uptick during and immediately after these events. In part because, for the most part, the Muslim population in Egypt was very supportive of these apparitions, right? The Virgin Mary is a revered figure within Islam. Even though it was kind of awkward from a Muslim perspective that she was appearing atop a Christian church, for the most part, the Muslim population of Egypt was very much supportive of these apparitions, and actually they contributed to a kind of brief sort of ecumenical period of friendliness between Christians and Muslims, which was really significant because prior to these events, the Coptic Christian population of Egypt was facing very much increased persecution. Right, 1968 Egypt. Right, this is not long after they had lost the Six-Day War to Israel, and the minority Coptic population within Egypt was being widely scapegoated for this loss. Right, there were conspiracy theories that were being widely floated around that the Coptic Christian population and the army had betrayed the country to the Israelis, right? They had sabotaged the war effort, and that's why Egypt lost the war so disastrously to Israel. And so there was a lot of hostility towards the minority Coptic population in the immediate lead up to these apparitions. And whatever one thinks of these apparitions, whether one believes they were genuinely supernatural or not, at least one uncontroversial benefit of the apparitions was that it really led to it stamped out that increasing persecution, and it led to this wonderful period of interreligious harmony and increased friendliness within Egypt, with the apparitions really functioning as the sort of linchpin for that.
Okay. And so I think another thing is, so this has been proven that this was not a mass hysteria. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know some people tend to be very skeptical when it comes to apparitions like this. That's usually their first thought is, oh, it's a mass hysteria. Everybody was hallucinating. So can you kind of explain to us like why that was not the case with this apparition?
Yeah, so in the book, so just to give a quick outline of what I'm doing in the book is, I first provide some historical background to the events, then I give a wide selection of contemporary eyewitness accounts so people can get a good idea of what the eyewitnesses claim to have been seeing. And then I spend the rest of the book looking at all of the scientific explanations that have been put forward so far to try to account for what happened in naturalistic or materialist, non-supernatural terms. And in my opinion, those scientific explanations so far really don't work. The ones that have been put forward up to this point are not very convincing. So one of those explanations, as you rightly point out, one suggested explanation is maybe this was mass hallucination. Maybe all of these people were simultaneously hallucinating this Marian figure atop this church. So the first thing to point out in response to the sort of mass hallucination idea is that the concept of mass hallucination is not at all validated within contemporary psychology. If by a group hallucination or a mass hallucination, what we mean is dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people seeing the same thing at the same time, but what they're seeing is not objectively real. What they're seeing is an internally generated hallucination. So far as contemporary psychology knows, there is no such thing as mass hallucination. There are no, this is not a phenomenon that's been validated by modern psychology, right? This is something that, for example, Tim Lomas, a psychologist at Harvard, has pointed out in his work on Marian apparitions and sort of paranormal phenomena. So that there is, so far as we can tell, there is no such thing as mass hallucination. If you've got lots of people claiming to see the same thing at the same time, that's good evidence that they're seeing something objectively real. Whether or not what they're seeing is actually supernatural, that's a different question. If you have large numbers of people claiming to see the same thing at the same time, that's usually taken as a pretty reliable indication that there's something objectively there. This is not a matter of internally generated hallucinations. Moreover, there's other aspects of the Zeitoun phenomena that don't fit in very well with the mass hallucination hypothesis, even if we take it seriously as a possibility. For one thing, the unpredictability of the apparitions are difficult to square with a mass hallucination, right? In other words, if we suppose that people are seeing this image of the Virgin Mary because of something like social pressures or belief system of the crowd or internal factors that happen to be shared within a large group, background beliefs that are widely shared, psychological dynamics that are operating in a similar fashion, if that's what's supposed to account for what people are seeing, you would expect that you would get the same reaction consistently, right? Because you've got the same people showing up night after night, or roughly the same people showing up many nights in a row. You've got the same social circumstances at play, the same belief systems at play. And yet, on a random Tuesday night, you might have 50,000 people camped out in front of the church from dawn till dusk till dawn, and nobody sees anything. And then 2 nights later, you get a larger crowd or a smaller crowd, and they see the apparition, which is there for maybe 5 minutes or maybe 2 hours. So if it's a mass hallucination being prompted by internal dynamics of the crowd, you would expect to get the same result with the same under the same circumstances. That's not the case. You get a very unpredictable set of occurrences. So none of that really fits in very well with a mass hallucination hypothesis. The other thing that conflicts somewhat, arguably, with the mass hallucination hypothesis is the photographs. We do have a number of photographs taken of the apparition itself and also of some of the other paranormal phenomena that were allegedly occurring at the time, like the glowing birds. So we do have a number of photographs that were published in Egyptian newspapers at the time. Some of these photographs are controversial. There's been debate as to their authenticity, whether or not they've been doctored. Other photographs have been argued to be more likely authentic. There's an American physicist, John Jackson, who's written the most in-depth sort of analysis of the photographic evidence arising out of Zeitoun. Just to make the point, though, that if any of that photographic evidence is legitimate, well, you can't photograph a hallucination. Again, that would be further evidence that what people were seeing was objectively real.
And I know a lot of people were also really skeptical. I know, good thing you brought up the photos. A lot of people were like, well, why was there not a clear photo of the apparition? And I guess my other question would be, how did they know that it was the Virgin Mary? Did they just assume it was her? And so how did they figure that out? That it wasn't like for example, like how did they know like it wasn't something like some sort of like hologram or something very, and it sounds wild, but I'm very curious because I know there's probably people that are listening that would probably have the same questions that I'm asking.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so in terms of the identification issue, right, why identify the figure as the Virgin Mary? Part of it had to do with the context, right? You've got a glowing, floating figure, a female figure, floating above a church dedicated to St. Mary. And so that automatically, would lead a lot of people to draw that kind of conceptual connection. But there was also the behavior of the image. So sometimes she would bow to the crowd. Sometimes she would appear to be blessing the crowd. Because again, the figure wasn't stationary. It would move from one part of the roof of the church to another. It would behave in an intelligent fashion, again, gesturing towards the crowd, gesturing towards the cross on the dome of the church. Sometimes, supposedly, she would appear with what looked like a baby in her arms. So there were aspects to the imagery of the figure that people led the crowd to associate it with the Virgin Mary. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But as you noted before, though, the figure never spoke, so there was never any verbal communication. And so, if someone wanted to really persist in maintaining that, well, unless the figure explicitly identified herself as the Virgin Mary, we can't really be sure. Okay, granted, one could take that stance, but the Coptic Orthodox Church, at any rate, took the stance that based on the context, based on the behavior of the image, based on the miraculous healings that were taking place during the apparitions, seemingly in response to prayers to Mary, that was also taken into account. So I should also briefly bring that up. I'll come back to the hologram idea in a moment. But the Coptic Orthodox Church, as part of its investigation, set up a medical commission supervised by the Coptic Pope's personal physician. Had a whole board of Egyptian medical doctors who were basically reviewing people's claims to miraculous healings. And there were a lot of claims of miraculous healings coming in, both from Christians and from Muslims. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Muslim community in Egypt was so accepting of these apparitions, even though they were taking place atop a Christian church, one of the reasons why the Muslim community in Egypt was so receptive to these events was that so many Muslims were being miraculously cured of serious medical problems, at least according to their own testimony. So that's another piece of evidence, again, worth keeping in mind, which, again, led people to identify the figure as Mary, right? Because they would go to the apparition site, they would pray to the Virgin Mary, they would see the apparition, and they would then realize days later that, their cancer was cured, or their gangrenous limb no longer needed to be amputated, or whatever the case might be. And we have examples on record of both those types of cures being reported. So in terms of the question of, well, could this have been, even if this was, so granting for the sake of argument, this was an objectively real image, that everybody was seeing the same thing at the same time, is it possible this was a technologically generated hoax? That's another question. So I have a chapter in the book taking up that possibility. And what I try to argue is that no, it was not a hoax for a couple of reasons. One of which is that there was no technology available in Egypt at the time, or arguably even available today, that could have mimicked the full range of phenomena being reported by the eyewitnesses. So for one thing, again, according to the eyewitness testimony, this was unambiguously a three-dimensional, solid-looking figure. So if it was a technologically generated hoax, we're not dealing with something like a spotlight, two-dimensional image. This would have had to have been something like a hologram. But we also know from the eyewitness testimony that the image was often moving and doing things like gesturing towards the crowd, blessing the crowd. This was not a stationary, immobile image. It was a moving image. And even today, we don't have moving holograms. Holograms are purely stationary. And in order for a hologram to be visible, you need very precise circumstances in which the hologram is generated. You couldn't have just done this easily on the top of this church, amongst these huge crowds, right? Holograms need particular circumstances to be generated, and holograms don't move. They're purely stationary. So whatever this was, it was not a hologram. Moreover, if it was a hoax, this raises the question of, well, who would have been generating this fraud, right? The two main suspects would be either the Coptic Church or the Egyptian government. And as I argue in the book, neither of those suspects makes any sense. There would have been this would have been far too risky for the Coptic Church to have attempted something like this. And the Egyptian government would have had no motivation to do it. They wouldn't have benefited from this in any way. And so I try to argue that the hoax model really doesn't hold a lot of water.
Okay, and I think another thing I actually want to ask is, do you think that because this happened over a Coptic church, do you think that I know some people would probably say or use that as like as an excuse of, oh, that means that the Coptic church is probably true. Or maybe that's like a sign that, that everybody should be Coptic. Now, how would you answer that claim?
Well, certainly that's not how it's been viewed subsequently in some of the other Christian communities in Egypt. So again, the Coptic Catholic Church came out publicly in support of these apparitions. They didn't view it as a call for Catholics to convert to Coptic Orthodoxy. The Eastern Orthodox Church, like so just in case some of your audience is unaware, so Orthodoxy is kind of split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox Church, or what's sometimes called the Oriental Orthodox Church. And so the Coptic Church is a branch of the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox Church, right? So Eastern Orthodox and Coptic Orthodox are two separate, they each view themselves as the one true church, right? Ecumenical relations between them are kind of complicated. There is sometimes limited intercommunion, but for the most part, they view themselves as distinct church bodies. Nonetheless, there have been Eastern Orthodox church officials who have come out subsequently and declared the Zeitoun apparitions to be authentic, to have genuinely been the Virgin Mary. So at least within the Catholic Church and within the Eastern Orthodox Church, there's not been any sort of felt need to view this as in some way threatening to their own distinctive ecclesial claims, or to be a kind of call to become Coptic Orthodox. Now that said, I suppose one could make the argument that maybe this is some evidence for the truth distinctively of Coptic Orthodoxy. That's not an issue I take up in the book. The book, I'm really just more focused on the question of do these events provide any good evidence for the reality of the supernatural? So I leave aside whether this provides good evidence for Christianity, let alone, some particular branch of Christianity. Personally, my own inclination is to think that when trying to figure out, so if one is already a Christian and one is trying to settle, well, should I be Protestant? Should I be Catholic? Should I be Orthodox? If Orthodox, which branch of Orthodoxy? My own inclination is that those issues are best adjudicated by reference to theology, church history, signs and wonders, miracles, I think, are not going to be the best way of making that judgment, in part because I'm inclined to think that the Holy Spirit is active in all of these branches of Christianity, to varying degrees. And so if the Pentecostals see miraculous healings, fantastic. That doesn't mean I'm going to go out and convert to Pentecostalism. If the Catholics have Eucharistic miracles, great. That doesn't necessarily mean Catholicism is the one true church. I think that needs to be settled primarily on other grounds. It's not to say these issues can't be brought in at all, but the primary grounds one should be using in making that kind of judgment are theological and historical, in my opinion.
Okay. And I think, so I know I also heard this, and maybe you can confirm it. So I think you mentioned earlier that obviously we don't know how many people converted because of this apparition to Christianity. But also, I also heard the argument that there are people that were converting to Islam because of this apparition as well. Now I know you said there's not really like solid evidence for that, but do you think that could be true? Like that, I mean, I guess in your opinion, I mean, do you agree that maybe there probably was people who thought of this as like a sign for Islam?
Well, yeah, I'm not aware of anyone. So I think it's highly unlikely that the Zeitoun apparitions would have prompted anyone to convert from Christianity to Islam. That seems like a weird direction to move on account of these events. However, we have very good evidence from just, again, broader Egyptian history at the time that there were lots of nominal Muslims who became much more observant Muslims directly as a result of these apparitions, right? That they started to take religion more seriously, the supernatural more seriously. They found a way to interpret these events in a manner compatible with Islam, again, because the Virgin Mary is a revered figure within the Quran. You can easily see how someone might be able to make that move. And we do know, again, that these events they were certainly correlated with a huge revival of religious observance in general in Egypt, both amongst Muslims and Christians.
Okay. And then now people do use the argument that she didn't speak, she didn't say anything. So, for example, I know in Catholicism, normally when there is a Marian apparition, there's some sort of message that is being relayed to the people, for the people. And so, yeah, so, I mean, a lot of times, or a lot of these Marian apparitions that we see today, especially like in Catholicism, you see that the Virgin Mary always has some sort of message. Now, for this one, a lot of people, I also read that a lot of people were very skeptical about this apparition because she didn't say anything. So a lot of people are like, well, what could have been the meaning for her showing up on that church?
Yeah, well, so to the first question, the fact that she didn't speak, should that make us more skeptical of either the supernatural nature of this or whether it was the Virgin Mary? I don't think so. I mean, even from a Catholic perspective, there have been. So the most prominent example I can think of within Catholicism, amongst approved apparitions, would be the Knock apparition in Ireland in the 1870s, right, where the Virgin Mary and I think it was John the Baptist and Saint Joseph, all apparitions of these figures appeared at a church in this small village of Knock, Ireland, and was seen by a couple of dozen people. And those figures never spoke, right? They never communicated anything either. And the Catholic Church still declared that supernatural. It accepted it as a legitimate Marian apparition. So there is some track record for silent apparitions of Mary, nonetheless being officially approved by the Vatican. So I don't think that automatically would have to cast doubt on Zeitoun. But to the question of what was the meaning of the apparition, right? Why was it appearing? What was the purpose of this? my own inclination, and that this seems to be a pretty common view amongst Coptic Orthodox Christians, was that the purpose of this apparition was to forestall a major period of persecution. So, as I mentioned before, in 1968, after the defeat of Egypt in the Six-Day War against Israel, um, resentment against the Coptic Christian minority was growing and growing and growing, and the Copts were being subjected to increasing persecution, right? And if you look at Egyptian history over the centuries, sometimes things are quiet. Other times, the Coptic Orthodox minority suffers absolutely brutal, horrific periods of persecution under Muslim rule. And so, in the wake of this war, the loss of which was being blamed on the Coptic Christian minority, there was very legitimate fear that Egypt was heading into another period of major persecution against the Copts. And so, many Coptic Orthodox Christians seem to take the view that the purpose of these apparitions was their protection, right? Was to forestall that renewed period of persecution, which, so far as we can tell, it succeeded in.
Okay, and I do want to ask. So I know some people in the chat, they were wondering. So if I'm not mistaken, you're not Oriental Orthodox, right?
Oh, no, I'm a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church.
You are Eastern Orthodox. Okay, that is what I was clarifying, because I think I read somewhere that you were Eastern Orthodox. Now, somebody did want to ask, what do you think about Our Lady of Fatima or Our Lady of Lourdes, about the apparitions?
Yeah, so I've got another new book coming out, hopefully later this year, early next year, on again on religious experiences more generally, where I have a brief section on Fatima. And Fatima is very interesting. The miracle of the sun is a very interesting event. Again, lots of proposed scientific explanations for what was happening there. I'm inclined to think that event has also not really been satisfactorily explained in naturalistic or materialist terms. Theologically, though, as an Orthodox Christian, I have more questions about Fatima because of some of what was being communicated to the children. For example, things like the apparition discussing purgatory, which is a concept rejected by the Orthodox Church, or some of the actions of the apparition I also find puzzling, right? Taking these very young children to hell to show them visions of hell. I realize there have been other Marian apparitions in Catholic history where that's taken place, but I find that sort of difficult to compute theologically. So again, I think there are aspects of Fatima which are very impressive evidentially, right? In the miracle of the sun, most especially. But from a theological angle, I've got questions about some of the Fatima events, and some of those theological questions, if I recall correctly, I would need to go back and revisit some of the material to make sure I'm completely accurate on this. So please take this with a grain of salt. But if I recall correctly, it seems to me that some of the more, from my perspective, theologically questionable material is stuff that only comes out in Sister Lucia's later memoirs, like the stuff that she's publishing, decades later in the 1940s and onwards, rather than stuff that was being contemporaneously reported. And so I kind of wonder if some of the events in Fatima were being being reinterpreted by one of those visionaries in subsequent decades in a way that was maybe not entirely accurate to the original events. Not that she was being intentionally dishonest, but that she may have been, through her own theological lens, have been interpreting certain things she was shown or told in a way that's maybe not completely accurate. So I've kind of long story short, I've kind of a mixed view of Fatima. I'm not entirely sure what to think of it. Again, I think there are aspects of it which are very interesting from an evidential standpoint. There are other aspects of it which I think are theologically tricky. I'd have a similar kind of assessment of Lourdes. Lourdes is very interesting. It was not a public apparition, right? Bernadette was basically the only person seeing the Virgin Mary at the time. Whereas, the miracle of the sun at Fatima was obviously very much a public event. Zeitoun was very much a public event. But of course, with Lourdes, you do though also have the discovery of the fountain and these some very impressive miraculous healings taking place. So again, but from a theological standpoint, again, as an Orthodox Christian, one complication for me surrounding Lourdes is the fact that it's typically taken as evidence for the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And the Orthodox Church very clearly rejects both the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and the particular understanding of original sin that it's grounded in. And so again, I think there are aspects of Lourdes which are interesting and seemingly impressive from an evidential standpoint, but there's also aspects that I'm kind of leery of theologically. So again, kind of a mixed bag from my perspective.
Okay. And then he also wants to know if you have a favorite prayer or a favorite saint and icon as well.
Yeah. Well, my patron saint. So when an adult converts to Eastern Orthodoxy, they get to choose their patron saint, and usually you're supposed to choose someone whose name kind of lines up with one of your own given names. So one of my middle names is John, and so I chose as my patron saint Saint John Maximovich, also known as Saint John of Shanghai and San Francisco. He's a modern Orthodox saint, very influential figure in sort of North American Orthodoxy. So someone whose life and writings I really admire. So yeah, if you're interested in Orthodox saints, I'd encourage you to look up Bishop John Maximovich. Favorite prayers? I mean, I kind of just follow like the daily prayer rule of the Orthodox Church. Those work just fine for me. I don't really have. I should probably have something like a larger roster of favorite prayers, but I pretty much just stick to the daily prayer rule.
Okay. And I guess I do want to talk about your book, actually. So let me pull this up. So this is his book in case anybody is curious about. So I guess I also would love for you to kind of talk about it. Is there anything that we didn't talk about in this interview that you also want people to know about this apparition of Our Lady of Zeitoun?
Well, so in the book, I do get into some additional, scientific explanations that have been put forward to try to account for these events. So besides the stuff we already talked about, like the mass hallucination idea, the hoax idea, I've got a chapter on what's known as tectonic strain theory, which was a theory developed by Canadian neuroscientist Michael Persinger, that he and a colleague wrote a paper on Zeitoun back in the 1980s that was trying to apply this theory to explain these events. So I've got a chapter looking at their theory and arguing that it also does not provide a very good explanation for these events. I've got a chapter on Freudian psychoanalytic explanatory model that a Canadian sociologist, Michael Carroll, put forward back in the 1980s to explain Zeitoun. And a chapter on a more recent body of work by Valeria Musso, which is providing a Jungian account of these events. So Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, Carl Jung developed his own sort of explanatory model of group visions. He was interested most specifically in UFOs. He was trying to provide a psychoanalytic analytical model of UFO sightings. And what Musso does is she takes Carl Jung's model, explanatory model, sort of explaining the UFO phenomenon, and she imports that into Zeitoun and tries to explain Zeitoun by reference to that. And I also argue that I don't think that explanation is very convincing either. Yeah, otherwise, I think what folks will probably find most interesting in the book is probably just the portions where I'm giving sample eyewitness testimonies. And we have thousands of these available from, again, scholarly works, from the Egyptian media at the time, from subsequent studies that have been done. And so I just provide lots and lots of examples so you can get a good sense of what people on the ground were actually seeing at the time, both ordinary Egyptians and also academics and foreign researchers who are on the ground and what they were reporting.
Okay. And yeah, so again, I just wanted to show this to anybody in the audience. If they're curious, if they want to buy this, you can find this very easily on the internet. I believe Amazon sells this, if I'm not mistaken.
It does. You can also buy it directly from the publisher, St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. And in fact, it's probably a little more expensive buying it through the publisher, but the advantage of getting it through the publisher is that the profits all go towards the seminary. So if you're interested in supporting like Orthodox higher education, buying books directly through their press is a good way of supporting them rather than Jeff Bezos. There is also, I should mention, that there's an audiobook version as well that you can purchase through Audible.
Yeah, I know I've been listening to the audiobook and I think it's really good. That's why I pulled on some of the arguments that you used because I wanted to bring this up on the stream.
Okay.
Yeah, and so again, this is a photo of Our Lady of Zeitoun, guys, of the apparition as well. And that's why I talked about like the blurriness of the photo, like why, like why this, why is it blurry? All that stuff. So I'm really glad that we got to discuss that specifically. So I guess to kind of wrap this up, where can people find you in your work?
Well, if you, I've got a faculty webpage at the Concordia University of Edmonton. So yeah, you can find a list. If you go to their website and just follow the links to the philosophy program, you can easily find my profile, and that has like a list of the books I've written and things like that. It's also got my email address. Always happy to answer questions about Zeitoun or other issues in theology or philosophy of religion. If people want to reach out, my Concordia email address is publicly listed there.
And then do you have any other books as well? Like what other books do you read? Because I know I believe you do have other ones, but they're on different topics. So I don't know if you want to talk about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, my first book that came out in 2019 was just in philosophy of science. So totally different area. My second book came out in 2021. It was called Assisted Suicide in Canada. So it's just looking at the euthanasia debate from a specifically Canadian context, and sort of arguing that Canada's decision to legalize this was a really bad idea. So basically, it's a medical ethics book. If folks are interested in bioethics or the assisted suicide debate, which actually, if you've got a lot of American viewers, a lot of American states are revisiting this issue now. So actually, it's a good topic to acquaint yourselves with. Something you might have to deal with as voters in the coming years. And then I've got another book that came out in 2024 called Alternative Conceptions of the Spiritual, Polytheism, Animism, and More in Contemporary Philosophy of Religion. Kind of a long title. But basically in that book, I'm looking at a lot of recent work on neo-pagan philosophy and philosophical ideas coming out of cults and new religious movements, and sort of trying to give like a sympathetic but critical summary and assessment of some of that work. And then I've got another book that should be coming out next year with Cambridge University Press, again, on the topic of religious experience.
Okay, and so are you planning on writing any more books on any other Marian apparitions? Maybe looking into some of them, or do you feel like Our Lady of Zeitoun is kind of where you want to stop at?
I've had some requests to write about some other modern Marian apparitions in Egypt. So the Coptic Orthodox Church, especially in the 20th century, actually has a pretty robust history of Marian apparitions that's not widely known outside the Coptic community. Some others of which, besides Zeitoun, are also, public events that were witnessed by, large numbers of people. And yeah, so I have thought about trying to do some further work on some of those other Marian apparitions. So, for example, there was a very interesting series of Marian apparitions at a Coptic Orthodox school in 1954 in Jerusalem, which I talk about very briefly in the book, but that I think would certainly warrant further scholarly attention, especially since there probably are still some living witnesses to that event. They'd be getting up there in years, but it would be interesting to track down some of those people and talk to them. So I've considered trying to do some further work on events like that.
Okay. All right. So, guys, I think we will wrap it up for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, for watching. Please go and get his book if you guys have not read it yet. There's an audiobook as well. So if you're not a physical reader, then please go ahead and do so. I think this was a very great conversation. I love getting to learn about Our Lady of Zeitoun. It's an apparition that I actually very much enjoy, and I actually do accept and do believe in it. But I know there's a lot of people that are very skeptical about it, and that's why I wanted to bring you on to talk about it, and you can hopefully clear up some of the confusion or some of the skepticism that surrounds Our Lady of Zeitoun. And I know the chat as well, they are also really thankful. Says God bless you all. Also, thank you for coming to inform us on Our Lady of Zeitoun, Dr. Travis. And then and then Christina is actually Egyptian. She's actually Coptic. She
Cool.
says St. Mary loves visiting Egypt ever since we hosted her in the Holy Family. So yes, everybody says thank you in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this, for coming on here. And God bless you and your work. And hopefully this will not be the last time that I bring you on here. I would love to talk to you about more other things. And hopefully we get to talk more about your other books as well.
Sure. Well, thanks again for the invitation. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you guys so much. God bless. Please make sure to take care. Later, I'll be on again as well. So just stay tuned for that. There's another live stream coming later on the afternoon. But thank you guys so much. Please follow Dr. Travis in his work as well. Do you have any public social medias or anywhere we can find, or do you have I'm
a dinosaur.
Substack?
I'm not on any social media.
Do you have anything do you have any blogs or anything or no?
Nope. Nothing.
Nope, just your books?
Yep.
Okay, all right. So just his books, guys. So go ahead and just go ahead and grab them and get them. And I think you guys will really enjoy it. So thank you so much. God bless everybody. Until the next time.